like it. If you didn't know what it was before, you'll know when you leave. I wanted to give a little update on who the Exit Planning Institute is, just for the new people in the room. The rest of you, of course, know this, but there are several chapters around the country, maybe a couple of dozen. And the Exit Planning Institute is responsible for certifying exit planning advisors, and we call that a SEPA. And you can earn your SEPA. It takes 4 or 5 days. We just finished a class in San Diego. Jamal was there. Nice place to go. They're not always that nice, but they're every month. And it's a neat certification for those of you who might want to figure out exactly what lens you see exit planning through. And it's for everybody who's in the industry. So our chapter is the Twin Cities chapter, and they did a survey recently, and actually our chapter is the best one in the country. And that's the truth. So you can be a member of this chapter. You might be saying to yourself, well, am I a member? How do you get, I don't have a pin, right? It's not like Rotary, we don't have a pin yet. But by coming to these meetings, you're a member, okay? If you just come to one meeting, then you're not a member, okay? So it's coming repeatedly. We have these every month, and we'd love to have you come back. There are some benefits that you get from being a member. One is education. Today, you're going to get educated on ESOPs. We have a curriculum that goes through the whole year, and we've got all these exit planning topics that are already laid out for the whole year. And education is probably the most important for a lot of people. If you are a SEPA, then you get continuing education to keep your SEPA active as well. A lot of people like coming here because of networking. So you get to network in this meeting. What I like about networking is that networking leads to collaboration. And I do what I call a home and home. You know how the Gophers play here and then they go up to St. Cloud. The home and home is I have people come to my office and I take a deep dive into what I do for exit planning. And we learn about that, and then I go to their office maybe a month later and do a deep dive in what they do. The reason that's important to me is because that way we can really find out where people's specialties are so that we can share referrals, because as Julie said, this takes a team of professionals. So membership is not onerous. To be a member, you just sign up, and it's $39 a time, and we'd love to have you come on a regular basis. I'd like to take some time to thank our sponsors. Sponsors actually help grease the skids on the revenue that it takes to rent these spaces and so forth. Many of you did not grab a burrito. That's also part of your fee, and so are those salted nut rolls, so please help yourself. Right? So sponsorship, if you sponsor, it's an annual sponsorship, and you get your $39 monthly fee is taken care of in that. And so that's an embedded benefit. Another benefit is that you get posted on things like this. You also get your logo on the chapter website, and you get to give a little commercial. So we're going to have a couple folks just stand up and quickly share their company and what lens they see the exit planning process through. Terry Krabosha is from Maslin, new sponsor. Terry, welcome. Thank you for sponsoring.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, and a shout out to Bob Morris. He and I had lunch together about a month ago, and he told me about EPI, and I came to the last meeting, and I was sold. So
early adopter.
I am. In my family, we had the first push-button phones when I was growing up. I am a partner at the Maslin law firm, and I work with companies, or we work with companies in my group as they're growing and scaling, and we do a lot of work helping them with succession and exit planning. I am also personally a qualified mediator and do a lot of corporate divorces, so as a result, I can work with companies who are having some conflict and help them work out of that. And I've also signed up to become a SEPA
Nice.
in May, so
Nice.
as I said, I'm
And where is that one?
full in Chicago, where my
Chicago.
grandchildren live, so.
There you go. Great. Welcome. Thank you. Brent Engelbrecht and Chris Jones from Sunbelt Business Brokers. Anybody? Thank you for your sponsorship. They are always around and do a great job. They're just not here today. Sean Sima of Sima CPAs. Sean's in the back.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Sean Sima. I'm with the accounting firm Sima, Flod, Mission, Ornstein. We're a firm downtown Minneapolis with about 20 professional staff. Pretty much call ourselves a full-service firm. We're primarily a boutique firm. My discipline is business valuation and exit planning, mostly south side representation, and then, during this time of year, it's 100% tax. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for being here during the tax season. Susan Stiles of Stiles Financial, I don't think she's here. Steve Browning is from Marsh Private Client Services. He gets insurance for high net worth families and business owners. Great guy to talk to for sure. Bob Georges of Wilkerson, Guthman and Johnson CPAs.
Good morning. I'm with Wilkerson Guthman. We are finishing up our 97th year of existence. So we've been working with closely held businesses for a long time across the Twin Cities. We do both the world of financial statements as well as taxes. And yes, Sean, it is tax season. And I will say, Sean says it's 100% tax, except when he's running the technology here. So there's a little piece he carves out. So appreciate you doing that. So, but good to be here.
Thank you, Bob. All right. And our company is also a sponsor. My name is Mark Hegstrom. I'm with BOSS, that's Business Owner Succession Strategies. We have a forced-phase program to help business owners, I think, with one of the best, not the best, but one of the most important things a business owner can do in the exit process. Do you know what that is? Getting started. We have a way to get people started. We have 2 90-day workshops that basically get you the first 6 months, that gets a business owner rolling on this process, and the magic that you see in their face when they get through that process is something. They feel so much more confident. And then they don't say, I'm going to exit in 10 years, dang it, I'm going to exit in 4 years, because that's when I want to exit, right? This 10-year thing is just prolonging the agony, right? For some people it's not agony, of course. So, our speaker today, sitting over there next to Julie, Will Becker. Will is a member of Chartwell Corporate Finance Practice, where he focuses on providing ownership transition strategies to middle market companies. They also participate in the execution of traditional M&A processes for both the sell side and the buy side transaction. He provides corporate consulting services for both private and ESOP companies, and he has experience within a variety of industry sectors. Will also has significant experience in valuations of companies and putting in place ESOPs. Will is a partner of the firm, and I think has been around since 2002 with them. And he's very knowledgeable. I've had the pleasure of talking with him several times. I know you're going to like it. Let's give a round of applause.
Kind of oversold me here, I think. So, thank you all for coming out. Such a pleasant morning. Glad your cars all started. I remember back in the day, mornings like this, I'd have to get charcoal and a garbage can lid and slide it under the car to get the car to warm up. I remind my kids that's kind of how I grew up. They have life a lot easier. Anyway, Julie, interesting comments. The Pepperdine report, we get that and we read that every, when it comes out. We anticipate the good data that's in there. We use a lot of the cost of equity data in our valuation from that report, so I would recommend, taking a look at that. And then just to comment on baby boomers, right? The definition of baby boomers is about a 20-year span of that generation. And if you think about, the comment of 4 years versus 10 years, we're about halfway through the baby boomer generation and basically that 65-year-old retirement age. So we all knew coming into early 2000s that M&A market was going to pick up because of this massive amount of ownership transition that was going to have to take place with that generation. And we've had the benefit of the last number of years, a great economic cycle, a lot of transitions going on, a lot of activities in M&A. Private equity is blown up, partly because there's so many companies that have come on the market and have been sold. And so the good news is that we're a little over halfway through that cycle. So still a lot of transition to take place. Anyway, so as you think about that transition, we like to sit down with business owners when they get to the point of thinking of what do I do next? And certainly they can think about passing the company on to the next generation. We've, I'm sure, all worked with companies that are multi-generational, and they've done careful succession planning to pass that on to the second generation, sometimes third. So there's that that option. There's certainly, as I mentioned, the option of selling to financial sponsors, private equity, right? Business owners get calls almost daily from people that are either with private equity or search firms working for private equity, trying to get them to consider having a conversation with them. They could sell to a strategic. Maximizes return. It's a very viable option. You have a lot of corporations, a lot of cash over the last number of years that are seeking to grow through acquisitions. And one option that doesn't get mentioned a lot because a lot of people don't understand it is you can transition through the sale to an ESOP. So I think Julie and Mark were asking me to come in and talk a little bit about ESOPs because it's one of those options for business owners that a lot of times they don't, if they don't hear about it on the front end, they never consider it. And on the back end, after their deal is done, after they've sold the company, I've had business owners say, I wish I would have known this because I would have at least considered it. So anyway, let's jump into an introduction to ESOPs. So what are they? So it's a unique option in that it's actually a qualified retirement plan, kind of like a 401k. It's a defined contribution plan that is governed under ERISA. Unlike a 401k that invests in mutual funds or so on, it invests in the securities of the sponsored company. So so we get to question a lot of ESOPs, and someone this morning was making a comment of people still doing ESOPs. We've heard about them in the past. Didn't know that people were still doing these, and so on. Well, there's more ESOPs today than there are publicly traded companies. Almost double. Private equity, which I mentioned, has really blown up in the last number of years. Obviously, they're the largest holder of companies, but ESOPs are quite prevalent, and they've been around for a long time. They actually date back into the 50s, kind of the very start of the concept. But in 1974, Congress enacted ERISA, which governed retirement plans. And that's where they codified ESOPs. And as they've evolved over time, Congress, seeing the benefits of employee ownership, enacted a couple of different laws over the years that have really been meant to support the growth and proliferation of ESOPs. And that is, in the 80s, they implemented what's called 1042, which is a significant tax benefit to the selling shareholder who sells to an ESOP. If any of you are familiar with 1031 real estate exchanges, it's basically exchange of like-kind property. Same sort of concept. 1042 allows a business owner who sells to an ESOP, a business owner who is a C corporation, sell to an ESOP and essentially defer the capital gains as long as they reinvest in U.S. securities. And there's nuances to all of that, but the basic concept is a like-kind exchange of their privately held shares for public U.S. securities. They can defer that capital gains until they exit those U.S. securities, which could, with creative estate planning, could be indefinite. Then in 1998, they passed a law that allows S corps to be ESOPs. The significance of this is S corps as a pass-through, essentially pass through the tax obligation to the shareholder. And in this case, the shareholder is a tax-exempt qualified retirement plan. The ownership percentage that the ESOP owns doesn't pay tax. So if you think about it in the context, 100% S corp or 100% ESOP S corp doesn't pay U.S. most state taxes. And the reaction to that a lot of times is that's too good to be true. There must be a catch, so on. It's actually there are really no catches. It is actually true, and part of the reason Congress passed this, again, to incentivize companies or business owners to think about this, and as I'll talk about a little bit later, yeah, ESOPs, there are costs associated with being ESOPs. This is basically to help offset some of those costs and give those companies a bit of a benefit to help motivate sellers to do this. Today, approximately half of ESOPs are S corps. So, what companies are ESOPs popular in? Manufacturing is probably the top. These are statistics off of the NCEO, from the NCEO. It's a National Center for Employee Ownership. It's a national organization that specializes in ESOPs and other employee ownership benefit plans. Their annual conference is coming to Minneapolis this spring in April. If anybody's interested in learning more, it's a great organization, great conference that they hold here. Professional technical services, what this encompasses is engineering, architecture, firms like that. Incredibly popular in this industry, partly because their assets go home every night, meaning their people, their staff, and they're well educated, they're highly marketable, and so one way to help retain those individuals is become employee owned. And as you can see, construction, I think somebody mentioned, I was talking to earlier, that they have some construction clients that are talking ESOP. We've seen a number of construction clients consider this more recently, and then so on down. And, you know, a lot of times we get ESOPs. Who's an ESOP? There's a lot of companies. So we put logos up here that hopefully you recognize a number of these, but as you can tell, it's across a lot of different industries. You know, retail, manufacturing, distribution, tech services, Cliff Bar, oldest company in the U.S., and King Arthur Flour, and so on. So kind of an interesting cross-section. And in Minnesota, we have 270 ESOPs that account for almost 800,000 participants of those different ESOP companies. So a significant amount of wealth transfer from business owners, not to private equity, not to large public companies, but to employees. And that's significant because it does keep capital in the communities in which those companies operate, and it actually helps those communities thrive because you're maintaining the companies in those communities, and you're bringing or distributing wealth to a larger base that live in those communities. Studies over the years have proven that ESOP companies are higher in productivity, higher in retention, higher or more economic, higher economic resilience. They have lower default rates on their loans, and basically they outperform publicly traded companies. So again, if you think about all of those and you think about what's what's behind that, it's, and you talk to business owners and some of them will say, gosh, I wish my employees were more engaged. I wish they felt like I do. The worry about how are we going to grow, how are we going to remain profitable, how are we going to remain competitive. ESOP-owned companies do it right, communicate with their employees, and engage their employees in this ownership program. That engagement helps those companies perform better. So how do they work? And please, ask questions along the way. I'd like this to be more of a conversation than it is.
One question.
Yeah.
SBA, you're going to cover that on a later slide. How does that work with it?
SBA?
What are the issues? SBA loans, what are the issues?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. How do SBA loans factor into ESOP? Basically, yes, you can use SBA loans. There are more hoops, just like there are, with SBA loans as compared to a conventional loan. Still, you can still qualify for an SBA loan. There's just more hoops to jump through, I guess, to put it that way. So, how do they work? So the one thing about an ESOP is, an ESOP doesn't come with capital, unlike other buyers. That's one of the nuances here. Private equity certainly comes with their own capital. Strategic buyers can come with, their checkbook. ESOP does not come with capital. So where does it get its capital? It gets its capital from banks or other capital providers. I'll kind of explain what that is in a moment. And it's really supported by the sponsor company. So the company goes to a bank and other capital providers and gets a loan or gets the funding. The company then lends that money to an ESOP. The ESOP takes that money, buys shares from the shareholders. And so now shareholder gets some liquidity, shares are held by the ESOP, and the employees who are participants of the ESOP are now shareholders. So this is kind of just very high level how it works. As the company basically generates cash flow, it pays back the bank and the capital providers, and I'll show in a couple slides how that works internally. But this is basically for a ownership transition. There are ESOPs that are set up that are more like basically just a benefit plan. They're called contributory ESOPs, where a business owner, for the sake of, I want to set up an ESOP because I want my employees to feel engaged as business owners, but I'm not really looking to transition, I'm looking to provide an additional benefit. You can essentially contribute shares into an ESOP, where the ESOP's not acquiring them, but you contribute them into an ESOP. It's called a contributory ESOP. Certainly a business owner could do that over the years. It's more like it's gifting shares into the ESOP. This is what we see more often as an ownership transition vehicle, because here the ESOP is actually acquiring shares from the business owner.
Would it be, you answered my question well, so I'm okay.
Oh, okay.
Would it be the company contributing shares to the ESOP in the contributory, or would it be the owner?
Generally, it's the company. It's the company issuing newly issued shares, in most cases.
Does the owner have personal guarantees on the bank debt then?
In some cases, yes, but not always. It depends on how much debt there is and how strong the cash flows of the company are. That a lot of times we see no personal guarantees on this bank debt. As long as, you know, if it starts to stretch too far, then yes, then there might be, but for a large majority of the deals that we do, no seller guarantees.
Well, I was just gonna add, if they do an escrow loan, the risk for the seller is they can't be released for the person's guarantee.
Yeah.
So they are on a.
I rented into a company in Mankato that had an ESOP, but it was only covering the people in what they call the office, not on the factory floor. Is that common that you kind of just restrict it to certain employees?
My guess is that they had a union.
Yes.
Yeah. So, short answer is, in those situations, yes. The explanation for that is, ESOPs are non-discriminatory, just like a 401k, meaning that if they were not union, so they were non-union shop, you cannot implement an ESOP that's for the benefit of the office employees, excluding the warehouse people. It's non-discriminatory, just like a 401k. Now, you can discriminate if it's a union, because generally union have their own benefit plans through the union, and so they can be carved out of the ESOP. There was a question about
Do you
that?
see many seller notes?
Yes, so, it's like softball to the Knicks. So, who are the capital providers? Generally, you know, most often senior debt. So, you know, they will lend into the ESOP or lend to the company for the purposes of an ESOP transaction up to, you know, the general, whatever they feel comfortable, right? And if you were to go from 0 to 100, the one thing I probably didn't mention earlier is that ESOPs are incredibly flexible. You can sell any percentage you want to an ESOP, 1% to 100%, anywhere in between. You can, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in the plan design themselves and so on. But in the case of, say, a business owner wanted to go 0 to 100%, and the reason they would like to do that is because of that S-Corp tax saving. So if you think about if an ESOP becomes, or a company becomes 100% ESOP owned and is an S-Corp, that 40, 50% distribution that was going out to the shareholders to go to US Treasury, pay taxes, is now retained and can help pay down transaction debt. And once transaction debt's paid down, basically stays in the coffers of the company and can help them do acquisitions, plant improvements, what have you. It becomes a significant competitive advantage over time in those S-Corp ESOPs. Now, to go from 0 to 100, you need capital, right? ESOP doesn't bring in capital. So, whoops. So it can go out, get, you know, whatever's a reasonable amount of senior debt, and And then just say that the equity value of the company is, X, gets debt, so it has to come up with a component of X minus outside debt. So that can come from sellers and seller paper. There are private equity and family offices now that are looking at these structures and saying, I'll participate in that. Those companies perform well. They generate great cash flow. They have the tax shield. That's a great investment. I'm not going to be able to be, the private equity group that buys the company, but I now can participate in this highly efficient transaction. So from a business owner standpoint, and this is getting a little bit, this is beyond ESOP 101, but this is really, it sets up a discussion for later on some of the estate planning and so on. If you do a transaction going from 0 to 100, you go out and you get your senior debt, and the business owner says, I will hold that, I will hold seller paper for the, the remainder of that value, right? And you look at, okay, well, how are we going to structure that seller note? Well, there's going to be subordinate to the senior, right? Senior debt, traditional banks are going to say, look, we have first lien on everything. So they're going to be subordinated. And if you've worked with providers of that sort of instrument, subordinated debt, mezz debt, junior debt providers, you know that they require a return that's higher than your traditional bank debt, right? So let's say bank debt's 5%. Your sub debt is going to require a return that's 10%, low teens in that range. Some of them go as high as 15% or so. So you could say, well, the bank or the business owner in that seller debt, if I can get a 10% return, that's great. I'd take that. But then you create, 10% interest rates pretty steep, especially when you're trying to basically pay down your senior debt. And so the way we structure these is tell the seller, your bank debt or your seller note, let's put that interest rate at 5%, sometimes even lower. But to get your market return of 10, let's put warrants on that debt. So you attach warrants to that seller note such that you estimate a total all-in return of 10%. And you make that seller debt basically interest-only payments until the senior debt's paid off. And essentially, it cash flows wonderfully. Now, obviously, this doesn't work in all cases, and when you have business owners who are, basically, I want to cash out and get, to the Bahamas, this doesn't work. But for those business owners who are looking at a longer-term transition, it's a great way to do it. So what happens is, essentially, you pay down that senior debt, and then you go, keep in mind, your cash flows now are having the tax shield, so you can amortize that debt much faster than you would, in a traditional setting. Pay down the senior debt, then you go back out, and so then the seller notes start to amortize, but you can go back to your debt, your capital provider, your bank, and say, I want to now refinance those seller notes. So you basically, bank says, hey, we had a great experience, you took out this initial debt, paid it down, let's refinance those seller notes. So you refinance the seller notes, you retain the warrants. Again, you basically pay down the seller or the second tranche of senior debt. And then the seller note or the warrants that you detach, which are generally 10-year warrants, you basically go out and refinance those with the third tranche of bank debt. So for the bankers in the audience, this is a 10-year lending opportunity.
How does it work with SBA in there? If they have SBA 7A, 504, whatever, what does the structure work with that?
It's I'll admit, I'm not an expert on SBA loans, and because of the complexities of this, that's why we don't see a lot of SBAs in 100% transactions, because of those restrictions. So another question we get is, well, we've heard that ESOPs can't pay, what other acquirers can pay. Well, that's somewhat true when you're talking about a strategic acquirer, in that, strategic value is basically, we always say from my valuation days, strategic value is unknown. I can't tell you what synergies the buyer is going to bring to the table, and of course we read in the paper all the time of silly deals that get done, and you go, how the heck can they justify paying that for the company? Well, they're factoring in some sort of synergy, right? So if your business owner or client is looking at, I want the last nickel out of this company, likely go seek a strategic buyer, right? But if you're looking at private equity, which is basically a financial play, ESOPs can be fairly competitive with those private equity values. And because essentially, whoops, again, hit the wrong button. ESOPs can pay fair market value. And how is fair market determined? Again, if you're familiar with valuation, generally the typical methodologies are market-based, so looking at public comparables, looking at multiples in the marketplace, in the M&A marketplace, but heavy emphasis on discounted cash flows. So, again, fair market value is a premise based on kind of an arm's length transaction between buyers, without taking into consideration any sort of synergies or anything like that. And that's really what a financial sponsor is doing. They're looking at the cash flows of the company and figuring out how much can I pay because I'm doing a levered buyout. What are the cash flows that will support the amount of debt that I can put on, and how much equity do I need to put in to get my target return? Well, that same concept is what an ESOP is. So they can be competitive with private equity.
Do you ever use excess earnings model?
No.
Why is that?
It's because it doesn't take into consideration the future cash flows of the company, is like a discounted cash flow does. And we don't see those models used very often for this context.
Okay.
Will, is the fact that they're not paying taxes beneficial to the lender in that discussion to get paid back?
In the context of valuation,
Right.
some valuation firms will incorporate S-corp benefit. It's a bit of a controversial subject with the DOL, who oversees ERISA, who oversees ESOPs. And so we don't. We generally don't. What it does is it gives you a little bit of comfort level of going to a higher range of the value.
Right.
But we don't explicitly build in and say, you're more valuable because of this ownership structure. That goes away, in my opinion, from fair market value, where it's willing buyer, willing seller. Now you're introducing a specific buyer and scenario. And so that's why we don't incorporate it. So kind of what are the post-closing requirements? So how do ESOPs work after the transaction? Who's involved? Well, first off, there's valuation that are performed annually. So as you have participants come in and out of the plan, you have to set the value at least annually. to determine what the value of their stock in their plan is. So there's an annual valuation that's completed. You have the record keeping and third-party administration, much like the 401k record keeping process. You have your 5,500 filings, and there's share allocations that are made every year. From a legal standpoint, less so on an annual basis. Basically, they're involved if there's a question about the plan design and modification to the plan design. Really, the legal's on the front end on the transaction. And then, just other kind of non-ESOP, long-term compensation, just other things, really, actually not ESOP related, but within the context of ESOP ownership may be considered. Yeah.
What's the legal costs approximately? Does it go by the size of the company or to set it up?
To set it up?
Yeah.
Not really the size. So it's a good question. I don't think I have a slide on the actual transaction itself, but who's involved. So I'll just talk about that a little bit. So on the transaction itself, generally, well, let's just say 20 years ago, ESOPs, let me back up. ESOPs have evolved over the years to the point today that they are more like a traditional sale transaction than they used to be. 20 years ago, we would get a call, Chartwell would, from a business owner who says, I'm interested in an ESOP. And, let's start with the valuation. So we do a valuation. We'd be like, yep, we like that value. We think that works. All right, then let's go ahead and do the ESOP. So then they would essentially hire an attorney to draw up the paperwork. We would then jump to the trust side, who's the buyer. So ESOP is held in a trust, and there's a trustee of that trust, just like a 401k. So they're the buyer, and we would jump to that side, and we'd be, yeah, okay, we'll do that deal at that value, and so on. Well, there were companies that were doing these sorts of transactions, and there were advisors that were telling business owners, oh, you can't find a buyer because you have issues with your company, let's do an ESOP. And so they would set up these bad ESOP plans and bad transactions, and the DOL started taking notice and started saying, wait a minute, these aren't real transactions. These are basically prohibited transactions under the context of ERISA, and start going after these bad actors and bad plans, and really have gone to the point of saying, look, if this is a true transaction, there are two sides of the table. This should be an arm's length transaction. So where we've evolved today is, on the sell side, you have a business owner who wants to go down this path. You have the sell side team. So you have someone like Chartwell, or a financial advisor, who's going to help structure the plan, design the plan, do the economics. Then you'll hire your corporate advisor, and maybe you bring in your accounting team. So you have your sell side team. And while it's not completely arm's length, the company or the business, basically the company, will go hire the trustee. And the trustee then will hire their legal advisor, financial advisor, creating two sides to the table. And then you actually negotiate that transaction between the two parties. So there are costs involved, because you're not only paying your sell-side advisors, legal advice, financial, and whoever, but you're also paying the buy-side advisors as well. So the trustee's legal advisor, trustee's financial advisor. The cost of all of those can depend on size of the company, complexity, structure. I will say, I think in the description of this session, which I'm not sure who wrote, but it said something about inexpensive. Honestly, ESOPs are not inexpensive. The cost of implementing the ESOP, because you're paying both sides of the table, can be anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 to $2 million. But again, that's partly why Congress passed some of these initiatives to incent business owners to think about this transition, and some of the tax planning that can come around and estate planning that can be designed around these plans can help pay for the cost of those implementations.
Could you speak for a minute about the governance? Because one of the things that always struck me is you've got a business owner, this
Yeah.
wasn't a business owner who is used to running his own show.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, he's got a trust and a real board.
I love these questions because it feeds right into my next
And
question.
they don't often understand that. I mean,
Yeah.
my experience has been, they don't realize it's
It's-
really not your company anymore.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You're right, but there's also this, it's unlike selling to a traditional third party in that you still have influence. And let me just explain a little bit of that. So how does this work? How does the governance work? You have your board of directors. Your board of directors appoints and oversees management. They have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value and set strategy and so on. They oversee management, who basically manages the company, hires and governs, the employees. Management and employees are participants in the ESOP. Okay? On top of the Board of Governors is the ESOP trustee. And if it's not 100%, it's the shareholders, right? These shareholders, which a trustee is technically a shareholder, elects the Board of Directors. However, the Board of Directors selects the trustee. There's a bit of a circular, if you haven't noticed, there's some circularity right there, right? It's unique, it's a bit odd, but the ESOP trustee cannot be on the Board of Directors because they have to remain independent. So they cannot take a board seat. But in addition, ESOP trustee has no interest in the management of the company. So rarely will they step in and tell the board, we want you to do this. They will be consulted and ask for approval on major initiatives such as an acquisition, a divestiture of a subsidiary or division of the company, and so on. Generally, the board will basically ask for approval from the trustee for that. Now, when the question about when a business owner sells, do they relinquish control? When they sell control, yes. But what we generally see is a lot of times, because they are still, if they take seller paper, they want to have some influence, right? So they will remain on the board. What we highly recommend, and what a lot of trustees have gone to today, is we want to see a board. Generally, you work with business owners, if they have a board, sometimes it's just the business owner, right? Or the business owner and it's the CFO and another member of management, or maybe it's family members, right? So it's a board, but it's kind of a friendly board, right? Well, what we see a lot now is we'll let you remain on the board, and maybe even another member of management, the CEO of the company, if you're not the CEO. But we want to see outside board advisors. And really, there's been a bit of a push to go from, if you have a 5-member board, we want a majority of outside board members on your board. So that way, you have a more sophisticated board, and a board that's not really exerting control of the selling shareholder, if you will.
What about the Bremer's lawsuit? So the ESOP trustee is suing the board of directors? Is that, or is it the other way around?
No. Bremer has an ESOP, but it's not 100% ESOP. It's held by a trust. Can't remember what the exact term of the trust, but it's held by a trust, and the trustees of that trust are the ones in dispute with management and I think the board. So there is a bit of that dynamic here. Although the board did not appoint those trustees, I think those trustees were appointed through the bylaws of the trust and, the Otto Bremer Trust. So I don't think there's that circularity in that case as there are in ESOP. So the trustee really is basically looking out for the participants of the ESOP. That's their duty. And so if there is a situation where there's a conflict here, and there really aren't very often, but the trustee can exert, some pressure on the board to make changes, to act, to do something. And it's quite honestly in the best interest of the board to do that because, again, the DOL, you don't let the DOL come knocking.
Well,
Yeah.
does the bank have a role either in serving as an ESOP trustee or pushing for representation on the board? A bank that lends to these
No, generally, no.
individuals?
Yeah. So, leads to a different question though, who are ESOP trustees? As I said, 20 years ago, it used to be the business owner would basically also be the trustee. So talk about conflict of interest and wearing different hats in the same transaction. We will always recommend that the trustee be independent from the selling shareholders. And there are firms like Bremer, Alaris, other institutions that have specific ESOP trustee services. And those are the type of firms that you want to hire for these transactions because they understand the process. And the DOL is all about process. And so they understand the process and they make sure that the board is following its governance and the ESOP plan is functioning properly. So that's what we generally see as who are generally serve as trustees. So then how does the ESOP work internally? So if you remember a few slides back, I said the company lends funds to the ESOP to make the purchase of the shares, and now basically those shares are held in suspense because they're collateral to the loan that the ESOP has to the company. And so what happens is there's an annual repayment of the internal loan from the ESOP to the company. Well, actually there's this contribution, kind of like a 401k contribution. There's a contribution made by the company to the ESOP. The ESOP turns around, pays that back to the company in part of its repayment of its internal loan, and then the company can then go pay the bank with that. As this internal loan is repaid, it releases shares that are held in suspense, which are then allocated to the participant accounts. And so, again, part of the plan design that we work with business owners is to do this over time. We a lot of times will set up this internal loan to be a 30-year loan. And the reason we do that is, as you pay over time, shares are released slowly into the participants. And you want to do that because you essentially you retain shares so that over time, as you have new employees come, you have shares to allocate to those new employees. ESOP plans fail, and you've probably heard of failed ESOPs. They generally fail because of a few things. One is, we always say, an ESOP will not fix a bad business plan. Don't do an ESOP if you are not functioning properly and financially sound. The other is when you don't have an ESOP plan that's well-designed, and so you get into situations where you have and have-nots, where you've allocated all the shares, and now all of a sudden you have this group of employees who've been with the company for 10 years, they have all the shares, and you have the group that came, after them that have nothing. And so that ESOP benefit of motivating employees to act as owners starts to fail. And all of a sudden, you start to have the we-they mentality within the company. So that's why, again, plan design on the front end is extremely important. Because this is a long-term benefit plan, a long-term transition. Yeah.
What does the company give out, as far as tax documents? Like a W-9?
They don't, because it's held within the plan. The shares are held within the plan. They're actually not allocated to the individuals. Just like your 401k has mutual funds in it and
Yeah.
so on, but you don't own that personally, it's held within the plan, so are the shares of the company. So ESOP participants really don't have a right to see financials or anything like that. The only thing they have a right to is to receive an annual statement that shows the value of their account.
But they don't have to pay taxes?
No.
Because it's an S corp? They
Well,
have to-
no, because it's a qualified retirement plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when do they pay taxes or don't they? I mean, when do they sell?
Just like your 401k when you start to take distributions. If you take a distribution from your, so,
Is it the same rates and things like that?
yeah, it's a retirement plan. So when you leave the company, when you leave the company, you get a distribution. You can take that distribution and basically, if you're not retirement age, roll it into an IRA. If you're retirement age, you can take that distribution. And then you basically pay tax just like you would on a distribution from
Regular
a retirement.
tax.
Retirement.
Even if you are retirement age, you can roll it to an IRA.
Yeah. Is there another?
Are you also going to talk about at age 55, you can diversify?
Yes, yeah, you're exactly right. So there are basically rules that, at age 55, you can start to diversify within the plan itself, and into other investments and so on. So,
Where does that money come from then, the diversification money? Is it the annual contribution is
Yeah.
diverted?
yeah,
So the loan wouldn't be repaid then, the amount going to the 55?
yes, generally, there's more money coming in than there's going back out. So these accounts have both shares and cash. And that cash is generally invested in a pretty safe investment. But that's, when you reach age 55, that's when you can start to diversify.
Is the excess cash coming in, is that allocated to the participants? So they would have ESOP shares as they're released, and then they could allocate that as they choose to investment choices within the plan? How does that work?
When they reach age 55, they can start to take some shares out, convert it to cash, and then basically invest that cash into other available investments within it. So,
And if there's a 401k right next to it, they can just transfer, right?
no,
No,
they remain separate.
they're separate, but they're rolled out, right?
No.
No,
The assets.
for the diversification?
Yeah, the assets in here stay in here. But they can basically set up like a mirror
Yeah.
to your 401k as far as investment options.
So isn't the excess cash allocated to the participants from day one, or no?
They're annual contributions.
So yes, the excess cash coming in is allocated?
Yep.
Okay, and then do they have the right to direct those investments for the excess cash or no?
No, trustee.
How does the owner get cash at closing?
So if you remember the slides back, so company lends, or takes a loan from the bank, lends it to the ESOP.
Yeah,
ESOP acquires shares from the business owner.
okay.
So it gets, that's liquidity there. If they take so they could do that in 3 different tranches. To the extent that they can get lending from the senior lender, you could do, 30%, and then another 30, and then, 40 again. So they can do it in stages. They can do it, like I said, they can get the liquidity from the purchase, take a seller note, and when they refinance that seller note, they can take liquidity at that point. As I mentioned, generally, to get fully liquid from the transaction is a 10-year period.
But what would you say the average break is as far as what they take down? And I get that over 10 years or more, they get paid with interest payments and with
A lot of them
stock.
will make more than what they could if they received it all and then reinvested in the market. People are chasing returns in the market. Obviously, bank interest rates don't pay anything today.
So a typical sale in my world is bank loans 50%, the seller loans 20%, and the buyer carries back 30%. And what
So
is,
in that scenario, it would be 50/50.
right?
You wouldn't have that 20% from a buyer.
So he'd get 50% down, or she,
Yep.
but they have to reinvest and avoid the taxes.
If they choose 1042, if they're a C corp and do a 1042, elect a 1042 treatment. So, yeah.
How did the ESOP decide how to allocate the shares to the employees?
question.
And can the employees contribute annually pre-tax earnings and buy shares like a 401k?
Answer the last question first, no. So one misconception is, well, the ESOP is taking my 401k funds to make this purchase and I'm losing, my retirement asset. That is not true. Some companies, again, did that. We don't see that at all today. Most of the time, we see companies, and we'll advise them, keep your 401k. Keep doing what you're doing. You don't want your employees to think that you took away a benefit for the sake of the business owner selling his company. Keep your 401k, keep doing what you're doing. Those assets are what they are. The ESOP is an added benefit to the employees. They don't write checks, no funds come out of pocket for that. It's funded through the company and, actually selling shareholder. So your first question again, Paul, how are they allocated? There's different allocation methods you can choose, but the most common are payroll. You can incorporate years of service. You can incorporate other metrics as long as they're not discriminatory. So what we see most of the time is payroll or payroll and time of service. So what that means is, yeah, your more highly compensated people are going to receive a larger allocation than your, lower compensated people. You can also look at that and say, who brings more value to the company? Senior management who's driving the company forward, or, the line worker.
There's no tax limitation on making it very profitable for the high-paid employees then?
There are limits,
There are limits.
just like your 401k, there's limits. There's 404, 415 limits, which means basically, in that calculation, it goes up to, I think, 265 is where you max, your compensation. So if you have a person who's making $1 million, their $1 million doesn't get considered in the allocation method. It's 265.
And then it's 25% of that.
Yeah, then it's
Okay.
Next.
max, yeah. So why do business owners consider this? Well, as I mentioned, it's highly customizable. It's tax efficient. You can design these plans to be, 0 or 1% to 100. We work with business owners, and I'm working with one right now that just keeps throwing different ideas at us. Okay, how about if we do this? How about if we do a partial ESOP, and I want to do an employee direct equity plan, and I want to bring in some outside capital because I have some growth initiatives. How do we do that? Well, we can do that. There's complexity to it, but the great thing is there's a lot of flexibility in how you design these plans. You can't create, there is liquidity, especially if you consider the after-tax, some of the tax advantages that are involved with an ESOP. It really creates goodwill within the business organizations. A lot of those logos that I had up on the slide before, if you go to websites or you read, their tagline is an employee-owned company. So it resonates well with their customers, with their vendors, their suppliers, just goodwill in the community, as I mentioned before, and so on. It really is basically a long-term preservation in that we've all heard the stories again of private equity acquiring companies and basically either shutting down, bless you, shutting down the company or shuttering employees. And 5 years when they basically flip the company, who knows what's going to happen then, right? So legacy is a big issue with a lot of business owners that we work with, right? Especially those who live in communities, smaller communities, where they're key employers within the community and they want to continue to live there. It's a great way to feel part of that community and keep that legacy.
How do you factor in the age of the workforce and thinking about that? Because if you have a lot of people who are near retirement,
Yeah.
and they want to cash in, how do you think about
I
that?
think that's the next slide.
You're welcome.
And as I talked about a lot of estate planning strategies around that. So, guess it wasn't the next slide, but unique tax advantages. I think I've covered most of these. So, attributes of a good ESOP candidate. So shareholder, as I mentioned, is not seeking to get the last dollar out. That wants to stay involved, and they may not have control, but they would have a meaningful say in the continuation of the company. Shareholders who want a desire to maintain their legacy, preserve jobs in their communities, and actually retain a financial interest, either direct, through a staged ESOP or, seller notes and warrants. And they value their employees. What we hear a lot of times, the business owners say, the employees are what really made me successful. I want to give back, and so on. On the company side, what you really need is a strong management team and succession. When you have a business owner who is the key person and basically wants to exit, ESOP's not the right transition tool. Because you need to have the management in place. As I mentioned many times, this is a longer-term transition. And so if that talent is leaving the day after, who's going to run this? I guess what I don't have up here, to your point, if you have a very aged work group, it becomes more of a challenge to do this. Because as I just mentioned, it's a longer term, and if you have everybody retiring, and you don't have that next layer or succession plan of management, it becomes more of a challenge.
Yeah, I was at Anderson Windows when the housing recession hit, and we had a bubble of employees who were at that retirement age. So you had the inability to really repay all of those obligations to people who had the right to take those shares when they retired.
Yeah,
It was really challenging.
We do a lot of what we call repurchase obligation studies, because if you do have that in your company, a big demographic of similar age people, and they all hit retirement at the same time, you have this huge obligation to buy them back. And it creates a strain on the company's cash flows. And if you do that in conjunction with the downturn in the economy, it can be a death spiral, right? We've seen companies go through that. So we work with a lot of ESOP companies to basically help plan for that and prepare for that and fund, pre-fund those obligations. If you can manage it on the front end, you have a lot better chance of surviving. So again, key attributes, financial. You need a company with good financial performance, with a history of financial performance and steady performance. If you have a company with a lot of volatility in its earnings, again, it's going to be a challenge. Part of it is because it's a levered buyout, and you have to have consistent, predictable cash flows to help fund the repayment of the debt.
What's a minimum valuation to do an ESOP?
So, in general, we like to say it's more of a employee base. We'll say companies with employees of at least 50 employees, because you have to have a broad enough employee base to make these work because of the contribution limits and so on. So it's that. We've seen ESOP deals done down as low as, on the lower end, it's usually, $5 or $10 million value for the company. It starts to get really expensive when you get to real smaller companies. It gets, you start losing some of the benefit versus the cost of doing ESOPs. Diverse labor force, all that good stuff. So power of ESOPs really is, it's about the legacy, it's about the culture, it's about attracting and retaining good employees. ESOPs generally have much less disruption than the sale to a strategic or a private equity. As I mentioned many times, it's benefit to the community, and it's a long-term proposition. So, I know we're running short, so I'll make this real brief. So, I just happened to grab this cup out there with water. We have a client that a little over a year ago, it's called Paper Machinery Corporation, based in Milwaukee. Rather large company. They make the machines that make these cups. They're the world's leader in that industry. Family owned, father, son, got to a point where they felt they wanted to exit. So they talked to, they had gotten calls daily by private equity. They had talked to strategics that wanted to acquire them. And they sat back and said, we have a lot of options on the table. And then they heard about ESOPs, and they said, well, let's explore that. And so they did. And so we helped them do that. We helped them look at an ESOP to be competitive with some of the offers that they were receiving. They essentially did a levered ESOP where they went and got senior financing. They actually went and got junior financing through a mezz provider, actually a private equity group that did some structured equity to increase their liquidity at close. And then they took seller note as kind of that last tranche. Completed the deal. They have an annual meeting where they have thousands of employees. They bring them in, and the owner will talk about his extended family being the employee base. And he basically said, look, we've been, he was, I think, 90, his son is 65 or something like that, or 60. And anyway, he said, there's been a lot of rumblings throughout the company about we're getting up in age and the company's going to sell. And he said, I'm here to announce that we sold the company. And there was this gasp in the air, right? Everyone's like, oh, no, what does that mean? And he said, well, I'm here today to introduce you to your new owner. And everyone's kind of like bracing for what guy in a suit is going to come walking on the stage and say, I'm your new owner, here's the new world. So he hesitated, he paused, and kind of the anxiety grew, the tension grew. And he said, turn to the person to your right, shake their hand, that's your new owner. And the people, it took them a second to sink in. And all of a sudden, he said, we sold it to an ESOP. You're the new owners. It was a great story. It was written up in the Milwaukee Sentinel. It was on the local news. It was a great story. Because we hear so much of this, kind of the Rust Belt, these companies have sold, moved on, they've been decimated by companies that acquire them, shut them down, and so on. It's just a great story. So I thought I would share that. Yeah. One other, Mark, I know I only have a minute left. There was one other kind of fun story that I meant to share earlier. So one of the questions about allocation and limits and so on, and how many employees do you have to have? One of the things back in the late 90s, after S-Corp, Congress passed the election to allow S-Corps to become ESOPs, there were some people that jumped on that right away and said, hey, that's a great tax shield. One of them happened to be very savvy attorneys, tax attorneys, said, Jerry, why don't you create an ESOP of yourself, become an S-Corp, and create this tax shield so you don't have to pay tax. And he did. And he did, and some other folks did, and pretty quickly Congress went, yeah, that's not what we really had in mind. So they quickly passed what's called 409P, which is basically a testing mechanism so that you don't have abuses like that. And it's really kind of a family, it measures the ownership of the top group, and if they're related, they're brought into that calculation. So you can't have this concentration of the ownership within a small group, and it basically is an anti-abuse thing.
He said, what's the deal with that?
So that's what I have today.
Great job.
And I guess I did my time.
And I'm sure you'll be around after to ask questions. All right. And then I'm also going to ask Jessica to send everybody the slide deck. All right, so you'll get that in an email. We're just going to wrap up real quick here.